Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Margavicius. I'm a Director of Strategy here at VMware. My job is to hopefully educate customers on where our vision and strategy is as it relates to end-user computing. As you saw in the keynote this morning, Pat was talking about lots of change happening and how end-user computing really is a new engine of value that we have somewhat overlooked for a while, but we really believe is poised for new growth and new opportunity. And so I want to first of all thank you for being here. If you would, please silence your cell phones. That's very much appreciated, not so much for me, but for those around you so they won't be disturbed. We have a lot of things to get to today, so we won't have time for questions during the session, but by all means, I will stick around as long as you want to up front, and come on up with your questions and we can answer them then. So today we're going to talk about some best practices as it relates to Windows migrations. By show of hands, how many customers here are currently running Windows 7? Lots of hands. Okay, arms down. By show of hands, how many people have actually begun their migration into Windows 10? Very good, very good. For those of you that have not, I encourage you to get started soon. Because there's one piece of information that I think a lot of customers forget very quickly. We don't like pain, and how many people really actually embrace the pain that we had from migrating from Windows XP to Windows 7. That was a very painful migration for many customers. But Microsoft was true to their word and said it's going to be end of life. And so the storyline is the same here. Windows 7 becomes end of life January of 2020. And so if you kind of look at a calendar and realize these projects can take, I don't know, 12, 18 months of effort, plus amount of work in terms of prep, realize that we're beginning to come close to a timeline that allows you to finish on time without being in support. And so today I'm going to share with you a lot of information about how migrations happen and why they're done in a certain way, and most importantly, some of the best practices that customers have told us as it relates to what got them to Windows 10 much more efficiently. So a bit of disclaimer, we have to say this, we don't want you to do things illegally or sue us based on the stuff. This is private information. Please understand that this is something that we take very seriously. So let's start with some detail. This is a quote from our friends over at Microsoft. We're suggesting changing Windows deployment from projects that customers do every 3 to 5 years to thinking about deployment as a process. You move to Windows 10 and then continually stay up to date with new features as released. And the benefits that you're going to get around security capabilities are faster, you get less disruption, and you simply have a better deployment process. There are things within Windows 10 that we have never ever seen before when it comes to the management of an operating system defined for a PC. And we know that a lot of customers have been at this for a long time. My first foray in PC management was around Windows 3.1. When I moved into Windows NT, guess what? We began with imaging over 20 years ago. And for that period of time since then, most organizations have managed pretty much the same way. You buy a PC from Dell, hopefully, HP, Lenovo, Acer, whoever it may be. We drop down our image, we test the heck out of it, we load some apps, we test again, and then we push out these images to a install base of machines that in essence allow us to run on those devices for a good long while. 12, 18, 24, some customers say 5 to 6 years on standard images that need to be done. And so that process is changing, and Microsoft has told us so in advance. And so how do you think about that? We think about Windows differently as a result, right? Windows is under midst of some major changes that really is different when you think about its value. It's no longer an operating system defined just for PCs. Tablets and smartphones and other devices is where Microsoft is targeting, taking advantage of new function and features in hardware that we've never seen before that allow better security, how you provision applications from a wide variety of sources, not just Win32 or Win64 apps that get pushed via some tool that we've invested in 10, 12 years ago. And the use case is ultimately very dynamic as well. We know about consumerization really taking root within the market, and that consumerization is a driver as to how Windows is being positioned by Microsoft as well. And so we really believe that when you think about what is changing, how you think about users' trust and device posture, how you invest in things like conditional access, and refocused on data loss protection. These are some of the key features that inside of Windows 10 now become available and really are for the betterment of the Windows platform at large. We endorse Microsoft for investing in ways to think differently because it is far more reflective to how the market is actually seeing value. So the thing about the market, let's talk about that for a second. 500 million devices so far. I would argue most of that's in the consumer. Inside the enterprise space, I do believe it's somewhere between 10 and 12% install base so far. So for most customers that raise their hand, chances are you're just getting started, but this process will move fairly quickly. The best thing that we've seen, though, is at the bottom right, best performance over compared to Windows 7, 70% of customers believe that the experiences that you get inside of Windows 10 is a better one. We really like the fact that Microsoft has looked long and hard at security as well. Windows has been very porous, make no mistake about it. It's been estimated by my friends at Gartner that if you look at all of the attacks that ever occur within an organization, over 70% of them enter an organization through a PC that is not managed properly, or by a user who unknowingly does things, click on an attachment, download a file, maybe it's a URL plugin, something to the effect that infects their devices today. And so, again, Microsoft has done a lot of really good work around ways to which Windows can be hardened more proactively, more effectively than we've seen before. As a matter of fact, we have customers like the Department of Defense who literally said, we're going to move 4 million PCs in a matter of 12 to 18 months to Windows 10, specifically because of the security issues that we currently have. And that it really bodes well. And then ultimately, we also believe that you have to get to a far better way of managing your environment as well. So the thing that we'll talk about a lot today is the state of Windows management, historically speaking, has been a really good thing for most customers. The fact that we apply any kind of management to a device, to an application, to a user setting, that we try to stay in line or in sync with things like Patch Tuesday and service packs, all very well and good. And we deploy security updates and patches as needed. But in reality, that approach is also becoming antiquated based on how people are using their devices today. It's also becoming antiquated because our ability as IT practitioners to actually stage and prepare updates is increasingly becoming less relevant based on the velocity of the market that we've seen around OS updates at large. And so what we are arguing for is a new framework around how you manage your devices, Windows and otherwise, that really will take you to a next level of manageability. I think about where we've been for the past 15 to 20 years as the first chapter of management. What we're talking about under an EMM approach that leverages our technologies that enables a unified endpoint management framework as the next chapter that customers should be investing in. A bit more about Windows migrations. We do a lot of survey work. A lot of customers have told us that's a high degree of importance. I don't think this should be any news. But we also believe that Windows 10 is not the only thing to be concerned with. If you recognize the second one, maintaining versions of Windows 7 and hopefully not Windows 8, but I'm sure there's some of it out there, that is also a high priority moving forward. And again, I can't emphasize enough that 2020 date come January is a very real one, and so the migration effort should begin sooner than later. So let's talk about the best practices. That kind of sets up the storyline about what we're thinking about in terms of its importance. So what are we thinking about? So the first best practice that we really want to kind of emphasize is that Windows migrations this time around is really about a Windows transformation. Unlike prior releases of Windows that we've seen out of Microsoft, how they're going to issue updates and how they're going to do refreshes of the product itself are vastly different than what we've seen before. We don't think about a Windows 11 happening in 2 years, and 4 years later a Windows 12, right? Or any kind of traditional staging that we've seen out of Microsoft historically. But instead, Microsoft releases something called Windows, and that Windows has a certain update to it, and that update will be refreshed periodically by Microsoft based on the market needs and changes that happen overall. This is what I refer to as a far more dynamic framework about how Windows changes. And so 3 years from now, you won't be buying a edition version of Windows. You'll just buy Windows on a device, and that version of Windows will be specific based on what the needs of the market are at that time. And so that's a really big deal, and that's a transformation about how Windows is managed long term. And so it presents an opportunity that can be a challenge for a lot of customers, because it may mean rethinking about how you do things like software updates and patches of security fixes. It also means perhaps there's a different way that maybe you don't have to be on-prem as part of a domain to do the management, but instead leverage the cloud or aggregated service. Perhaps it's delivered in a desktop as a service framework through one of our partners. How you think about Windows being delivered is vastly different. There are new tools. The SLAs are going to be. We think about unified endpoint management as being the kind of the heart and soul of delivery. But ultimately, even though these changes can be problematic for some customers to kind of accept and kind of get their head around, it will give you better management long term, and we also believe, without a doubt, it will ultimately be less expensive from an OpEx point of view. So why is that the case? Well, we know that the use cases around end user computing has also changed dramatically. Today, nearly 65% of all PCs being purchased in the market today are notebooks. And if you recognize that the majority of notebook uses is actually off-prem, not as part of a domain, I work from home, a hotel, a Starbucks, having the ability to manage that is a very difficult thing to do. Microsoft has also introduced modern applications that are provisioned via a store model, right? And that traditional management tools that we currently are using don't necessarily facilitate very well for that architecture. The fact that we're now embracing a mobile approach, just like Apple does on the iPhone and other devices like the iPad, that the way in which updates are occurring on those platforms is actually a very good and well-tested model. And that for a large number of our customers, this is almost a preferred method of management by relying on the manufacturer to do the updates, right? We don't stage or test iOS updates. We just kind of accept them as a known good thing. And I will tell you this, when I tell that to customers, they say, well, we don't trust Microsoft. And there's some legitimacy based on the history of how Microsoft has done Windows updates in the past. But I will tell you that over time, Windows does get a whole lot better. Right? We think about the stability of Windows 7, and we also think about when Windows XP was retired, how stable that platform really was from once it first began. Windows 10 is going to follow that suit, and the good news here is, because of how Microsoft now does its updates, it's going to happen much quicker in terms of levels of stability. And so at some point, it will make sense to actually trust Microsoft in terms of its updates that will be applied to your Windows 10's devices. Right? And we also know things like the whole BYO model, how many employees are requesting to have their own devices. Increasingly, when you see successful products like the Surface Book and the Surface Pro in the market, those devices actually end up being fairly good clients within an enterprise that you may not necessarily own, right, or have ownership of, or control of, or management of in a traditional model. And so the point is very clear. The market has changed around management requirements, and that legacy tools no longer really fit the bill, and that we really have to think about ways to do that. So again, historically speaking, when we think of traditional PCM tools, having the requirement to have on-premise requirements, you have to be part of the domain to get an update, right? And if 60% of my users are now notebook users, that model doesn't work. We don't have really good visibility sometimes in terms of what the user can see or do. And so sometimes updates just go out there blindly, and we hope and they pray that they actually stick and they work. And how do we find out if they don't? The phone rings off the hook, or emails start flying in, or I get messages galore about how bad IT is. This reactive approach to seeing the value that I've tried to define within an update process is also something that has to change. And so we need more granular knowledge and insight, analytics that go into the details. We also know that despite our best efforts, and we heard Pat talk about it this morning, we as an industry have failed the marketplace in servicing you well around security. And that what we have done around things like installing VPNs and having the ability to do monitoring of spam and malware and infectious things that affect our devices, is something that remains to be a constant thorn in the foot. And we don't do ourselves much favor either, right? We know full well that in terms of how we configure Windows traditionally, we've also configured it in a way that allows our users to get in trouble. We've basically given them the ability to harm themselves whether we want to or not. Admin rights and privileges is something that we still see for most customers being pretty common across the board. And why do we do it? Because the users request it. But it exposes the attack vectors in a significant way that really compromises Windows long term. And so we really think about ways to changing what we've always done in a way that makes good sense. Now some customers will say, well, you know, that's all well good theoretical, but what's the real value? At the end of the day, I have to justify what I currently spend. And so I grabbed some numbers from my friends at Gartner that are still really relevant when you think about traditional management. Most organizations will spend somewhere between $2,500 to $4,500 per user per year in the care and feeding of their Windows environments. And that becomes a very costly model. And you look at the breakdown, the expense associated with that is predominantly labor. So 75 cents of every dollar goes into the skills or personnel or the efficiency lost as a result of how we manage today. And that we really need to think better, more effective ways that allow this to be a far more fluid and more valuable experience. And so the cost model that we apply to PCs is no longer sustainable, especially when you focus on the rate of updates that Windows is going to be going through, that a different approach and a different model, one that we're referring to as unified endpoint management, is far more valuable, and we'll talk about that in a second, and that these new tools that are servicing endpoint management is a better way to go. When we think about what we do today, on average, when you buy a new machine, you spend close to $2,000 on the cost of the provisioning of that device today for a new OS deployment. And it is a very expensive approach to doing that. Moving forward, we believe that you need to move away from imaging as a complex set of processes over time. We're not saying abandon immediately, but over time, imaging needs to start dying on the vine because there's more efficient ways to getting updates down to a machine and getting new software out to those devices. We also believe that focusing on getting users up and running very quickly is really important, and that, again, tribute to Microsoft, what they've done inside of Windows, having an out-of-box experience that is ideal based on what they need is really important. And so we offer things like leveraging Azure AD as a cloud provision service that determines the policies that get applied to a device. So the analogy I always like to use is that if I have a device that I just got at Christmas as a gift, and I provision it in a way that allows me to log in with my credentials on my Wi-Fi at home in my pajamas on Christmas morning, I can get that device configured in a way assigned to me reliably, securely, without any kind of IT intervention, and having up and running in a matter of a few minutes. This is really the new model and architecture that we think about when provisioning Windows that is far more customer-friendly, more pull-based versus push-based, one in which the users tend to get a much better value without introducing huge costs or huge disruption to the work that they do. So let's talk about unified endpoint management. I've kind of brought up the term. It's very simple. When we think about unified endpoint management, we're really thinking about provisioning users based on what they need, what their users want. And I could ask you by show of hands, but I won't. I will tell you. They want the device choice. Apple proved this to us early on. We continue to see it today. Right now, the mobile phone market is dwarfing the size of the PC market, and there's no signs of slowing down. On average, most users today carry somewhere between 2.7 to 3.1 devices in their hands today to use as a means to gain access to their organization. Over time, that number is expected to double. Again, referencing my friends at Gartner on those stats. So whether you believe that device diversity is happening or not, that horse has left the barn a long time ago. And so diversity is job one for what we need to think about provisioning. And whether that device is Windows or not is really what we're trying to focus on. Secondly, what do users want? They want choice. They want choice of apps, services. Sometimes they're productive using Twitter as a means to communicate business value. Sometimes it's gaining access to a published app that you've done for them very well. Other times it's a cloud-based service. Many customers are beginning to investigate whether or not Windows stores are actually a good way to deliver value, or maybe it's our legacy Win32 experiences that are also equally important. Our customers want diversity in terms of apps and services based on their needs, not based on what IT chooses to provision. And we've done a pretty good job overall, but our ability to be effectively prescriptive of what they need around apps continues to diminish with each iteration of technology. We also know full well that there is a large number of new employees entering the workforce who in essence have a perception that they know more about IT than the IT practitioners that are serving them. Right? They want choice. They feel that they should be able to gain access to apps and use the devices that they so choose. They also believe having the ability to work wherever they want, whenever they want, is really a much higher requirement than ever been before. Some call that a perk. I know that in the Silicon Valley, it's almost a requirement if you are a company that is serviced out there, because if you don't do it, your good talent goes elsewhere where they can get to that. And so this new model of value stems from changes and dynamics of the marketplace that really need to be captured in the traditional PC landscape as well. It's a better user experience. It's about real-term visibility that we can actually protect environments. It's secure. It's most certainly scalable, that we can address the needs of our users regardless of what they think about. Right? And we'll talk more about that later, but ultimately this idea of a unified endpoint management is really the framework that we think about. Don't think about PCLM as something that goes away, but it's part of a bigger storyline that in essence encompasses far more than just a device. Best practice number 3, a lot of customers are also puzzled with what Microsoft is doing with the releases of software. So when we think about Windows, Windows comes in 3 different flavors. By show of hands, how many of you have actually been invested in the Windows Insider program? Imagine a good number here. So that's great, because Windows Insider program is really Microsoft's first foray to offer you the opportunity to test a new operating system. And so if you are technical in nature, or maybe not quite so, it's a good thing to kind of experiment to get an idea of what's coming down the road. It's released right away. As soon as they finish a feature, they throw it out there, and your PC is automatically updated if you're enrolled. And then based on your function, they have some analytics that go on in the background, plus your feedback within the program, they basically make Windows better. There's a fast ring and a slow ring, depending on what you want to do. But here's the thing, it's not for production. So I encourage every customer, if you're interested to see where Windows is moving in the future, get involved with the Windows Insider program. But do not deploy across your production systems for your users unless you really want the phone to begin ringing. The other branch that they talk about is what's known as the long-term servicing channel, right? They used to call this long-term servicing branch. They changed names a few months ago. Windows goes beyond just PCs. So if you are a customer that is in, let's say, retail or manufacturing, and you have point-of-sale devices, or you have barcode scanners that are provided by Windows, or in the medical industry, instrumentation, what I would call very fixed function devices that require Windows, this is really what this branch is for. This technology is rock solid. It doesn't change. It gets in place for a period of 2 to 3 years, and updates only come down when they have to based on certain security needs. And that the changes around here are really designed to be extremely minimal. And I have some customers who say, you know what? This is ideal for us. We are really slow. We don't like changing Windows. We like the idea of having an image that's tied to the device. I like the days in which I could buy a PC and bank on it being there from my manufacturer for at least 2 to 3 years, right? And they say, this is the branch for me. I will tell you this is not the branch for you, because the updates that are occurring here really aren't designed for general purpose compute. These are specialized devices. Microsoft has special relationships with the manufacturers of those devices. These are vertically kind of solutions. The area that you need to be focused on is the middle one. They have something called a semi-annual channel, and this is really targeted at traditional mainstream PC usage that hits the market. It is designed for most common types of devices that you buy at the store or buy from your manufacturer, and it is really targeted to be on a cadence. They're going to update this twice a year, depending on the updates that come down. And it's going to be available for a period of 18 months. Now, here's the interesting thing. The first phase is known as pilot, which typically is a 3 to 4 month period of time that Microsoft releases the SAC. Early adopters are going to test it. validate it, and most importantly, report back fixes and bugs that occur. Now, I don't know about you, but I like how my organization wants to perceive me. If I release buggy software to my users, that's not a good thing. So what most customers will do, and our guidance is, in terms of best practices, think about adopting when pilot moves to broad phase. And that's when, after that 3 to 4 month period, Microsoft will make a general purpose release that in essence allows you to standardize it on all your devices. And at that point, because we've already gone through the WIP and we've gone through the pilot phase of this channel, there's a really good probability that what they release is actually pretty stable. And the feedback that we receive from the market is that's absolutely true. So that's really good because there's been a lot of work invested up to this point. It's not like we're releasing a service pack and that service pack is hope and pray that it works. Instead, this is a far more granular model that injects changes to the operating system that are far more consumable to you. And so our guidance is, in terms of a best practice that we've heard from other customers like yourselves, wait till it hits broad adoption before you adopt. That does mean, however, that the long-term viability of that release that you get is literally only 12 to 16 months, depending on when you adopt there. And so this is part of the thing. So ignore the first two, really focus on the second. That's where you want to be. The fourth thing that I've seen a lot of customers really fail at, and this is kind of perplexing to me overall, is that so many customers think that this is a laissez-faire activity that needs to occur within an organization. You really need to have the right types of people to get this done. And I know it may sound redundant, but I've seen so many customers do phenomenally good engineering or architecture or design, and they ultimately fail to get the input of their users or understand the changes that occur within the infrastructure, like your networking or your servers or your security. All of things deviate in terms of value. And so design a plan that makes sense, that really capitalizes on all the requirements that are needed, and having a good project manager is really important. Again, when you think about a project, for most customers, they're going to spend, again, typically 12 to 18 months on a Windows migration is what we have seen in the market. Some customers are more aggressive. I've seen some Windows migrations be slammed in place literally in 3 months for 10,000 machines. So it can be done, but just recognize it really takes a lot of effort. You have more people involved, do good project planning, that's really a best practice. We also believe that a best practice that often is ignored is trying to reduce the complexity of what we currently have and do. So how many of you customers, well, I won't ask the question, but just like if you are at home, you live in a house that has a garage, and you want to paint the garage on the inside, so you take everything out, you paint it. Now, do you really throw everything that you just put in the driveway back in, or do you actually take the opportunity to say, I don't need this, this is no more, this is my kid who now in college is a pair of skates that when he was 5 years old he used, right? Take the opportunity that when you do a refresh of technology like Windows, to reduce the number of applications if you can, so it makes good application portfolio analysis. Really inventory what you have and determine what you need. Look at the number of machines that you're trying to deploy and determine whether or not you need all the variety, or really you're trying to update PCs that are 7, 8 years old that probably should be headed to recycling. Reduce the complexity as much as you can. And a Windows migration is a great opportunity to start fresh. And so many customers say, well, that's a lot of work. Well, yeah, it is. I'm sorry to say. But ultimately, you're going to be well served if you take those actions today versus waiting till later. There is a lot of work involved. So another best practice is literally plan your work in advance before you work the plan. There are lots of things that happen when you migrate machines and users from one instance of Windows to another. And I'm not going to go through any of these things in any great detail. Some of this is common sense. Some of it is, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. But when devising a plan for migrations, think of all of the contingencies that go into place. Think about your planning and your timing. Most importantly, think about and involve your users. We don't see nearly enough intervention when it comes to Windows migrations. If you just communicate your intent and your plan and your strategy in a way that is not viewed as threatening or overly problematic or too evasive into the work that they do, you're going to have a far better level of success and customer sat long term. When thinking about a Windows migration, we really do see a variety of approaches. 4 in particular that are most common for users. So all of which are viable for a Windows 10 deployment. And so customers will ask me, so Mark, when we're doing a Windows migration, should we throw everything up on Horizon and put it in VDI? Well, I say, well, how many mobile users do you have, and how often do they work in a disconnected state? What about your customer service people? Yeah, that makes sense there, perhaps. Don't think about Windows 10 as strictly being the only solution for all users. It is an operating system that has great applicability across many different use cases, and the result, you also get different ways to deploy it. So in no particular order, PC refresh. So I refer to this as a big bang approach. Most customers think about this that says, all right, we have an antiquated pool of devices. These PCs be anywhere between 4 to 6, maybe even 8 years old. Some of the machines may even be running Windows XP. Hopefully not, but in some cases we find that. And that they basically say, it's time to get rid of old machines, let's buy new. It's a great way to begin, if you can afford it. And so it's vendor-supplied hardware, you've got warranty that comes with it, you employ over-the-air updates, it's clean, it's easy. On the downside, it can be costly. And we also know that when you consider OEM technology, they often include things that you may not necessarily want. And so there could be a lot of work involved in determining what you should or shouldn't keep. And then we also know that if you rely on basic generic imaging, like we've seen some customers do, that is often also incomplete in terms of what is required, and that you need to augment that with ways to get software down to these devices, apply policy in a way, maybe you have tons of GPOs that need to be applied for specific users, and that ultimately you have additional work that goes. And so it's important, you got to do it. We think a lot of customers will do PC refresh by and large. But we also know Microsoft actually, again, to their credit, made Windows upgrades very easy to do. In-place upgrades, so if you're currently running Windows 7, there's a feature under things that allow you to say, upgrade to Windows 10. And it will just do it without requiring you to reformat the drive, re-image it, or apply any kind of unnatural activity from a user's point of view. And so from our customers' feedback, this is very easy. As a matter of fact, my first 3 or 4 machines that I did were done in this way. You just do a basic in-place upgrade. It moves all my data. It moves my applications. And for the most part, it worked okay. There were some minor issues that you run into around app compatibility, but ultimately these things can be worked through over time. So in-place upgrades are attractive if you're a smaller customer. Just recognize that you are going to carry over the baggage that used to be on that machine. And so if you are trying to reduce the amount of diversity and complexity, if you really want to give the users an opportunity to start fresh, in-place upgrades aren't necessarily viewed as a good thing. And so I'm mixed on in-place upgrades. For some customers that have very well managed experiences today, limited application portfolio, and they've done all the testing already, in-place upgrades are a viable way to get to Windows 10. It allows you to extend the life of the PCs that you already have in place, and it allows you to have users in a very productive state without very much disruption. But if your existing PCs are very old, and they have some real problems associated with them, either in terms of functionality, performance, or features that you don't necessarily want from an IT admin point of view that should be really gone, this could end up being a real headache for some of you. A lot of customers who have PCs that are in ages, let's say anything under 4 years, are going to really reconsider reimaging. And so this can be a great way to also extend the life of your devices. So the good news is Windows, from its design, will actually run well on old hardware. They started this with Windows 7 by making it far more modular. So instead of applications grabbing Windows memory resources and holding them, and not moving them, and not releasing them, like we saw in Windows XP, Windows 7 and Windows 10 continues. It says, all right, when a process is complete, let's free up that memory so that we can actually allow it for other apps and services. And so the end result is PCs running Windows today are far more efficient, and you can get better bang for your buck, better gas mileage, as it were. And that's actually a very good thing. If you have machines that are older than 4 years old, I would really question whether or not you want to do in-place upgrade or reimage, maybe as a means to extend life until you get budget to get a new machine, but we haven't seen real good success. There's some flakiness about old drivers that aren't necessarily carried over. Reimaging can be time consuming. Again, depending on how many PCs you have, the number of machines that you have, and currently the number of images that you support, this could become an overwhelming task. Windows, despite Microsoft's best effort, is still specific to the devices that it manages. So having a generic image that applies equally well, let's say, on a Lenovo and a Dell and an HP machine just really isn't all that viable. So you need specifics around each image for each of the devices you have. And so again, if you have a large pool of machines that are very diverse, that you had PC acquisition strategy that said, buy when we want, when we need, and we never really kept good practice around the acquisition of devices, this could become a real problem in terms of its diversity and the amount of effort required that you have to think about. And so it's not perfect, but for some customers, you know, they have really standardized devices, that they have one model of machine that services 85% of their users. That device is managed by perhaps one or two images at most. And in those scenarios, applying a new image in that case would actually make good sense. And so, again, I'm mixed on reimaging depending on how your scenario plays out. There's not a one-size-fits-all that really makes sense. And then finally, when we think about the value around Windows, true to VMware's form, for those of you who don't know, we have a product called Horizon that publishes VDI within your data center, and Windows 10 is a great client that resides there. So why would you want to do this? Well, first of all, if you have VDI, VDI has great value beyond just being an operating system place. It provides security that you can't get on a device. For some customers, it provides far better levels of manageability. That I can provision VMs dynamically, and I can manage much more effectively, and that I, the administrator, can actually manage users far more completely than I can do on a traditional device. Some organizations are governed by security and compliance needs, where having any kind of operating system or data on a device is viewed as a no-no. We don't want that. And so instead, it's a device-driven strategy that says thin clients are what are going to use, rely on a protocol to actually remote into a session and gain access to all the value that Windows can provide there. And so the use case around VDA is well understood in the market. We estimate somewhere around 20-25% of all users can be serviced very well by a VDI strategy. And for a large number of our customers, it is a what I call foundational building element for all your users. It can be complex to set up, right? It does require infrastructure, right? If you're not deploying VDI yet, even though we have made huge improvements around things like efficiency, how memory utilization occurs, how we can actually do better processor utilization, alongside with all the technology improvements that our hardware manufacturers have done, faster chipsets and memory, et cetera, at lower price points, it's still more expensive than a PC. When I can buy a PC for $300 or $400 and plan on keeping that device to 5 or 6 years, the economics of that rationale is very tough to compete with, regardless of how good VDI gets. And so for some customers who aren't doing VDI yet, recognize it can be somewhat more expensive than what you traditionally do on a PC. So the point is simple. Windows 10 will live and breathe in many different forms and shapes. Depending on what you're trying to achieve, you may be best served by having one or several of these approaches when deploying a Windows 10 situation. Best practice number 8, we also believe that you should be able to embrace the new and eliminate the old. Operating system improvements, generally speaking, fix problems that we have had in the past. And so specific to some things that we've heard from customers. Regarding the BIOS partition issue, if you are currently doing in-place upgrades, make certain that you convert to UEFI and GPT and eliminate BIOS and MBR. The reason is very simple. All of the enhancements that Microsoft has introduced around Windows are tied to hardware. And so if you rely on BIOS, BIOS doesn't necessarily have the levels of protection from a hardware point of view that you really want to take advantage of. So converting to these new file formats and replacements for BIOS really enhance the experience that tie the operating system to the device in ways that we've never done before. And so if you want the ultimate level of security associated with Windows to a device, to kind of eliminate some of the headaches that Pact about, to inject good security hygiene, right? Getting to a known good state in a far more complete way is really the goal here, right? I did hear from a couple one or two customers who also said, be careful if you currently do encryption. There are some minor issues on some machines that if you apply BitLock and try to do this conversion, you could be bricking a machine. I haven't verified that, but I would say test this before you go broad stream on this approach. Okay, so it's more than, thank you. Person generously offered that it's more than just BitLocker. Any kind of encryption could present this kind of problem. Okay. Let's talk about existing migration tools. If you have in place, if this is targeted, if you're going to do an in place or a re-imaging, we encourage you to use Microsoft and VMware tools and existing PCLM tools. So if you're currently an SCCM customer, a Landesk customer, chances are that you are. There's still some really good value that we believe occurs by leveraging those tools. We're not telling customers to displace PCLM entirely, but try to augment it in a way that we haven't done before. And so in order to do that, one of the key tenets of value that VMware tries to inject to our AirWatch technology that manages the device. So many of our customers really are already standardized on AirWatch for all of their mobile devices. We're #1 in the market in terms of volume, as well as leadership, features, etc. AirWatch technology now applies just as well on top of a Windows 10 machine as it does, let's say, on an iPad or an iPhone. And so for the very first time that we've ever seen in the industry, you can standardize on a management platform that works across all of your devices. Last week, talked about an announcement, we're actually going to be managing Chromebooks as well. And so the strategy behind VMware around device management is that we don't care what type of device, it just needs to be managed. And manage it in a way that's consistent across the organization and consistent for your users. And so if you're going to leverage existing management tools like SCCM or Landesk, make certain that the AirWatch agent is included so you can actually roll forward and manage Windows 10 devices just as effectively as you manage your mobile devices. On new installs for PC refresh, we also believe that you can leverage runtime provisioning tools, XLM scripting, for example, and also embed the AirWatch agent. This offers dynamic provisioning and it's far more flexible, far easier to use, and ultimately is going to be a simpler process. So I'll show you in a second, but we know the headaches around traditional management really requires an infrastructure of servers and policies, et cetera, et cetera. Moving forward, it's our belief that most organizations will establish a policy engine that will be far more effective in managing exactly how a device gets configured for Windows. And that ultimately is a good thing. From a people point of view, we know that a lot of customers have historically built these siloed models for support that are focused on a platform like Windows, like mobile, or specialized in a product like Landesk or SCC. Our belief moving forward from a best practices point of view, you have to build a strategy around unified endpoint management that takes into effect not just Windows, not just PCs, but you really need to provision users in a way that allows them the flexibility and the freedom to gain access to the apps and their service require. And so this is a different way to think about management. I think this is almost an orthogonal view in a management where we've always kind of positioned value around device and platform and operating system and application, but instead let's look at the user and see what the user needs, and when we do it that way, we'll realize that we can actually build a far more complete solution that allows us to manage more effectively. And because of those changes inside of UEM, from a function and feature point of view, one of the things that we have recognized in several of our customers is that it requires some changes around skill sets and organizational structures. So many of our clients still have teams that do mobile, and they have desktop teams, and they have app delivery guys, and they have Zen desktop guys, and Zen app guys, and cloud app guys, and they provision as a service to this URL, and that you have teams of people in each of those areas, many times who aren't all that friendly and don't say hello to each other at the coffee pot, and all dynamics that really are conflicting in nature. And at the end of the day, what we're forgetting is it's across all those technologies that our users are served. And so we think an alignment around organizational structures is ripe as well. At a minimum, We've already seen this happen for some customers where they just bring mobile teams and desktop teams together, and we call it end user computing. And we don't focus on Windows, and we don't focus on Mac, and we don't focus on smartphones, or we don't focus just on any one component, but by designing a strategy for organizational structure that's reflective of what the true needs are, it's far more efficient long term. When we think about VDI in particular, I kind of already mentioned this. There's no reason why customers can't continue to deliver a VDI experience that delivers all the things that they require inside of Windows 10. For most customers, by the way, they deliver non-persistent or persistent desktops. And in the market, generally speaking, it's a 50-50 split overall. Funny, I speak to customers about their installing. I continually get that feedback from our client base. Most customers will deploy VDI for very specific use cases, like a call center, in a non-persistent way, so any user can log in at any time and gain access to all the apps and services. And other customers say, no, we got a team of developers over in India or Pakistan or maybe Israel in the Eastern Europe bloc or something, and we don't necessarily trust their organizations, we don't trust their politics or their government, so we have to reside everything here. But they're really smart people that do great work, and they need persistence. And so we persist a desktop experience specific to each one of those users to allow them to be as effective as they possibly can. Engineers, software developers, financial people, all kinds of folks that we kind of fit in this market. The point is simple. Regardless of where you fit on that spectrum of persistent versus non-persistent, Windows 10 is applicable across the board, and that the management tools that VMware provides inside of Horizon are absolutely going to be there to help you service those users that allow their applications and their data to kind of go ahead and live effectively. So when we think about app provisioning in particular, one of the things that we've seen really good success, and I've already spoken to just a handful of customers just here already today around Windows deployments, is that if you're not leveraging app stacks through app volumes, you really should. When you create an empty app stack, it's a very simple strategy. You basically create layers of abstraction that allow you to install apps as almost as a service. And that based on the user's profile and definition, the apps that they require are actually dynamically delivered to their desktop experience. And so the reason I mention this is that it really, and I'm not being overly emphatic here, it dramatically reduces the number of apps and images that you have to manage. And so the reduction around testing and validation and integration goes way, way down. And then just by simply provisioning an app stack, you in essence can have economies of scale by volume that in essence make it far easier and more effective to manage long term. And so app provisioning is part of your VDI story, is most certainly a best practice. So many of the customers I speak to just don't know about it. And so I encourage you that if you're heavily invested or considering VDI for your Windows 10 deployments, that you most certainly need as part of your strategy. So our final best practice that I really like to communicate here, that is really element that I've already kind of alluded to, you really need to embrace a modern management style around UEM. And so when you think about management of a device, it's really that the device gets managed in several different ways. On one hand, we think about delivering value to Windows itself, just like we manage a mobile device. So in it, we can manage things like policies, and we can do things like provisioning of the user and the device. We can customize an environment that is specific to the user based on the requirements of the organization. That's all really important. But we also realize that you need to carry forward some of the things that we've always done. And so with VMware, we actually enforced GPO policies. We can now do push versus pull technologies. Having BIOS capabilities and having the ability to track the device. Again, if we think about how compromised so much of our information that we don't know is the fact that the device is still somewhat unprotected. And so we do everything that we can around the device and the operating system to guarantee that we can secure it. And then we also take care of the patching of the operating system in ways that we haven't done before either, right? And so instead of relying on Microsoft to say, all right, here's a patch Tuesdays here, and you go ahead and test and verify it, you'll be able to slipstream updates into the OS image dynamically, leveraging AirWatch to manage that experience so that it's far more resourceful and valuable, that the level of attacks and the amount of compromise gets dramatically lowered. And so the first aspect that when I think of is really talking about ways in which to modify and protect the device and the operating system. That's exactly what we try to do. But we also realize that UEM does not stop at Windows. It doesn't stop at the machine. We also have to think about the provisioning of applications. And so the real reason why most organizations continue to use Windows is not because they love Windows, but because they're using the apps that run on Windows. And so part of our strategy is that when you think about UEM, you also have to embed management of applications as well. And so how do you provision Win32 legacy apps? How do you embrace enterprise app stores as the new architecture for delivery that we've seen? Wouldn't it be really cool if users who are knowledgeable and fairly cognizant of their end user experience can actually enroll in a self-service approach? And then why not keep track of it all as well? And so Microsoft, through Windows 10, has actually opened up these portals of value, as it were, and that AirWatch actually enables that to occur. And so if you think about AirWatch strictly as an or an MAM type of environment just for managing a device, that's not the case anymore. What we do inside of AirWatch around Windows management goes much deeper and broader across all aspects of that experience beyond device and into the applications. And then finally, again, a real key deliverable of value that Microsoft has stated around Windows 10 is its new, what I would call, feature sets associated with security, where you can actually do far more around the validation of a device to ensure that Windows is not being compromised in any way, where you're not strictly depending upon antivirus and VPNs to provision security, but you can actually check the status of a device to see if it's been compromised. You can do things around BitLocker that we've never done before, how we actually can enforce policy based on a compliance set of rules that you establish, so that on that Christmas morning when I log in from home on that new machine, I'll get provision deemed to get, but the apps that I shouldn't because they're so confidential and I need to be on a private network to get them, will be able to apply policy to disable that functionality as well. So the idea of introducing conditional access based on context of who I am, where I am, time of day, day of month, network that I'm provisioned through, now configured as part of the policy of how Windows is reflective to me. This is different. This is completely new in terms of how we constitute value. And so this is UEM. This is modern management. This is how you think about moving forward around a Windows 10 deployment. So don't think about Windows 10 provisioning of an operating system on a PC. You need to think about it about that in addition to the apps that are serviced, the users that need access, the security that wraps it, how we do updates, how do we do provisioning dynamically, effectively based on policy, one that is scalable, one that doesn't change necessarily based on when it's kind of entered the foray of use for our users, right? So that we can manage the new Chromebook just as effectively as we can manage a Windows machine moving forward, or that iOS device, or anything else. And so this is modern, this is how we think about moving forward. And so to kind of summarize where we're headed, if you are a customer that really gets to SCCM and you want to migrate your policies, VMware makes available a management migration toolkit. You see the URL at the bottom of the screen. It basically allows you to migrate your GPOs from existing Windows configuration to Windows 10 that will be managed by AirWatch to deliver a new Windows 10. Okay, and so we do that for your GPOs. We have an app migration tool as well to move those Win32 apps. And if you are a Dell customer, we can actually apply the conversion from BIOS to UEFI as well. So there's some tools that allow you to actually get to current state hardware configurations as well. And we make that available for free, and you can go ahead and look at that stuff. And that's great if you plan on doing kind of in-place upgrade. For any kind of migration, you want to leverage your existing tools. If you currently are running Windows 7 or 8 on an existing PC, you can actually use the in-place upgrade approach, where you say you click update, and you can actually apply those same kind of tools to get to the same result, right? The right-hand side, the UEM model that we're talking about, managed by AirWatch, managing all flavors of Windows. If you re-image, and let's say you want to build a new image, and that's because you've got practice in imaging, and you've got really good people that know how to do imaging. We only have one image to manage across the organization, and you're not ready to move beyond imaging as a practice. We understand. That's a common occurrence for us. But if you're going to do that, include the AirWatch agent. Because what you'll be able to do now is that even though you standardize on imaging as a practice, embedding our technology as part of that image allows you to migrate into UEM. It's a really good strategy to move forward. So when you're ready to embrace a new approach to managing Windows, all the clients that you've migrated to Windows 10 are ready to go. Likewise, if you plan on doing a PC refresh, you can leveraging provisioning packaging services Sometimes the OEM will actually have those in, but regardless, if you do that and you want to get an image, deploy the AirWatch agent on it as well, and you'll achieve the same result. And so, regardless of the model that you want to get to Windows 10, we can help tools and services to get you there very quickly and very effectively. I'm going to finalize on two last pieces here. We know best practices very well. Those are the top 10 that we've seen, but we also know that there are things that can get in the way. You need to recognize there's migration pitfalls along the way. If you don't get if you think about this as a single project for all migrations, that's a problem. Many people underestimate the level of complexity that they're dealing with, that we have seen. They don't estimate enough time or money or people resource. Staffing could be a real issue for some customers. It's not uncommon that some customers actually do things, where a PC migration ends up being an improvement on a directory structure, or maybe it's server infrastructure, and that this one project serves as the beachhead for lots of other IT initiatives. That is a real problem. Stick to Windows migration, and you'll be far better off. I encourage customers to think about migration. I always refer to as taking Fridays off in a figurative, not literal sense. If you do migrations 4 days a week and you take Friday to kind of recoup, see what worked, what didn't, and attach problems and fix things, it gives your staffs that are doing these migrations a bit of rest and gets them ready for the next week, which is really what you want to do. Measure, measure, measure. You don't to the organization at large without having some kind of measurement of value, and you need to really have a good plan to do so. And some other things that I'll let you read through. So final thing, those are the top 10 that I talked about. There are other things that you want to think about here. Don't start inside of IT on a migration, please. And don't start with executives either. That's an equation. I've heard more horror stories, more jobs get lost. IT is great because they'll provide you immediate feedback, but the reality is IT users tend not to be the norm, right? They have use cases and products and tools that they have on their machines that are often out of the scope of what a normal machine configuration will look like. Likewise, executives far less patient with your results. And so if you go forth on the first day and say, Mr. CIO, here's your new image, and it doesn't work, or the new configuration fails, you get a blue screen or something crazy, all of a sudden you're now tainted, right? And so there are lots of other things to think about around a best practice. Common sense stuff, send emails. I've seen people do balloons on cubes, say, hey, your PC's been migrated, welcome aboard kind of thing. Give them bagels and food. People like food, makes them happy, right? Lots of stuff that you can do around a migration to make this a very positive experience that isn't necessarily a problem for your customers. So final thoughts. This is hard, and I don't mean to diminish, even though we've been doing migrations for 20 plus years, don't underestimate the effort. This can be. UEM is the next big thing. You really ought to be getting on that bandwagon sooner than later. Microsoft themselves talked about it. I showed that quote at the very beginning. How Windows is being serviced is changing dramatically, and you need to get ready for that. And methods and approaches that we've done in the past don't necessarily align to that. Lots of people out there willing to help, VMware included. Understand the priority of the project as it relates to other IT initiatives. There's always going to be firefights and projects and support. This is a project, and handle it as a project, and then ultimately establishing credibility with your users. So, with that being said, that's the end of the formal presentation. I got 1 minute left. Very good. I encourage you. I talked a lot about UEM and how it's changing. And I encourage you that in a mere 30 minutes from now, we're doing a digital workspace keynote. Our end user computing leaders, Sean, are going to be sharing their vision as well as VMware's vision as how EUC is changing, incorporating much of what we've talked about here. And if you really want to learn a lot about how this is evolving, I encourage you to go there. Finally, last set of services, lots of stuff out there that you can look at. With that, I want to thank you very much. I'll stick around to ask questions and have a great remainder while you're here at VMware.